Good morning, viewers. Welcome to Frankly Speaking with Vibhuti Jha. As I have often told you, and I have often shared with you, that we talk about issues that dominate our discussion, our lifestyle, and they impact us one way or the other. So we have talked about many things, and one of my favorite topics is talk about Hinduism, the way we are, the way we ought to be, the way we have been, and the way we can be. That is one of the key issues that we are going to talk about today. We know that the world is driven and it is impacted remarkably adversely by religious strife that is going on in the international geopolitics, whether it's US versus Iran, Saudi Arabia, India's Hinduism, and the accusation of the West that as if everything about Hinduism is negative. And people, but then there is a general acceptance of the Hindu way of life as well. Many Hollywood actors and actresses who have gone to India to do a film, they come back duly impressed about India's mystical and mysterious ways. That we have so many gods, we have our own truly democratic principles of religious life in which there are no restrictions, no mandates, no compulsions. You can pray, you need not pray, you can pray whoever you want, doesn't matter. Now, these are all issues that impact. In addition to the fact, we also live in a system where Christians say Jesus is the only way, and Muslims say Allah is supreme. So, in this antagonistic attitude that my way or highway, how do people, we are the most elevated form of life on the planet Earth, we the humans. Are we truly elevated? Have we achieved elevated equilibrium in our own lives? These are the issues which impact us dramatically. To discuss this, I have great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Koenraad Elst. Dr. Koenraad Elst, welcome to the studio. A little bit of an introduction about him. He's from Belgium. He's a student who did his Hindu study from Banaras Hindu University and also did his PhD on Hindu philosophy and Hindu way of life, and he will tell you more about it. But my curiosity is that as India's mysticism attracts many foreigners to come and study, and there are people who are scholars who study things because they want to know more. So Dr. Elst, welcome once again, and please share with my audience about how you drifted into study of Hinduism. And you are a graduate student from Banaras Hindu University, so it must have been quite some time ago. And you have been on the US speaking to Hindus and Indians in temples. And you have been here for the last 7 weeks, am I right?
Right.
And you have been to Washington, California, Los Angeles, and speaking to Hindus about Hinduism. Right. How wonderful is it that a Belgian who studied in Banaras is giving talks about Hinduism to us Hindus? So share some part of your life story that our audience would definitely be very interested in.
Well, let me start by saying that is a typically Hindu question to ask. If I tell Muslims, you see, I'm an ex-Catholic, I'm interested in religion but not committed to any specific one, immediately they flare up. Then you are available to become a Muslim. And so they find it perfectly natural that I know something about Islam, that I know some Arabic terminology and so on. Of course I would. It's the superior religion. How can you not be interested? Whereas Hindus always wonder, what? Interested in us? Why would that be? Whereas in fact Hindus have a lot to be proud of. So that's mainly the stuff I'm interested in, not so much India and its politics and so on, but mainly what Hindu civilization has to offer.
And when you say about what Hindu civilization has to offer, you made a very, very interesting point, that when you talk to others, most of the Indians, Hindus will ask, why about us? Whereas other people will say, why not about us? So that's a very important distinctive element, which I call it low self-esteem.
Right.
And that bothers me. I'm not a person, I'm very aggressive. That's my program is known as Frankly Speaking. And aggressiveness is not wrong. There's nothing wrong with being assertive or aggressive, so long as you remain civilized in your conversation. So Share with your early part of your story. At what point in time you realized that Hinduism has a lot more to offer that took you to Banaras to study in BHU?
Yeah, well, there are a few childhood memories that in themselves could have gone any which way. I really got interested at age about 18 when I first read Hume's translation of the Upanishads. In fact, very characteristically, the book had an orange cover. It really set the atmosphere at first look already. And you see, there I got the same experience that Schopenhauer and Faulkner and many great Western thinkers had, namely that this is it. This is really the best that mankind has produced. And so that was a very important step. Then a totally different, unrelated event at about that same age, when, you know, among young people we were thinking about what we were going to do in the future and so on, about the big questions. You know, we had some very heady conversation. And at the end, you see, this girl said to me, "I hope you find the truth." And so I thought, hey, well, yeah, that's it. That's what I want to do with my life. And so in that project, I dare say that Indian thinking played a very important part. You know, looking for the truth. I did not think you could bypass that. So that's a very important factor.
Brilliant. It is very fascinating that it was a young lady who told you, go, I hope you find your truth.
Right.
And proves another point that behind every effort there is another woman behind the man.
Sure.
That's very fascinating. Now, tell us about the story of Banaras. I have been to Banaras. Many of my friends have been from Banaras University. I've been to all the ghats. I've had the kachoris and everything else in Banaras. But you went in Banaras at a time when it was not so developed.
Right.
Share with us your experience of living in Banaras, because Banaras from the Hindu point of view is one of the most important places.
Yes.
And one of the things that really bothers me, and I'm very frank about it, is that when I find that there are, people are migrating, non-Hindus are migrating to that place, I begin to suspect the motive behind it.
Yeah.
So tell us something about your experience of Banaras.
Yes. Well, I was a tenant of Vibhuti Mishra, who was the high priest of the Sankat Mochan temple, famous Hanuman temple. In fact, in 2006 thereabouts, it came in the news due to an Islamic bomb attack. And so he gained the heart of Hindus and secularists alike, when immediately thereafter he came on TV asking Hindus not to take revenge, you see, to stay composed. Now, he was very much into Hindu art, like the very best music I've ever heard in my life was at his home when somebody gave a vocal concert of Carnatic music. Anyway, back then already, people said that Banaras is the oldest city in the world. Now, last year there was a newspaper item about some archaeologist saying, we've been digging in Banaras and we found it is the oldest city in the world. Well, I can tell him, okay, this is probably true, but it's not news. In Banaras, everybody knew. So yes, it has a very special atmosphere, of course. Very many ancient and important religious places. The birthplace of Parshvanath, for example, the last but one guru of Jainism. Ravidas lived there, Tulsidas lived there, and so on. You are immediately at home in the great Hindu tradition, many different phases of it. And so people go there precisely to feel, to experience Hinduism. And you feel it all the time. For example, the road from the university to the city center was hopelessly congested all the time. In those days, still with bicycles. Now, I really don't know what they're doing with the car traffic these days. It's too narrow. But you can always take the boat across the Ganga to the city center. And you see, there you really feel the atmosphere of Banaras. empty on one side and the city on the other with the burning ghats and all that. So in terms of atmosphere, there's nothing like it. The place where I always went to the river, there is a sacred tree with little murtis and so on hanging in it, and it's a really important place of worship for the common people. So you see many different faces of Hinduism. I've never been in the Kashi Vishwanath, which is supposed to not accessible to non-Hindus. I've never tried, I don't know. But then there is another Kashi Vishwanath, a new one in the university. And there you can immediately see the difference between traditional Hindus in all these little temples, not just the Kashi Vishwanath. For example, the Har Siddhi temple in Ujjain, a very small temple, extremely good atmosphere. By contrast, you see the big temple in the campus is like all these temples in America, full of plastic, let's say. It doesn't have the same atmosphere, though if it is used long enough, probably it will develop the atmosphere. At any rate, that's one thing I notice about Hinduism, is the very special atmosphere of temples. There's really some energy building up there through all the devotion over the years, through the rituals. So that's one important thing I've taken home from India.
That's so brilliant. And now the point that I would like to also know from you is that, did you find the truth?
Well, let's say that I stopped looking for it. I am relatively satisfied in that regard, yes. I think in India, and you know, there's not very far to look, the yoga tradition is unsurpassed. Of course, there's a lot of misuses and so on. I know. Nevertheless, if you take the real thing, it is unsurpassed. You see, everybody in the whole world can learn from it.
Yeah, this is what the thing is, that seeking a truth in your own life is a classic way of our way of life, is that you seek out the truth, because human beings are not perfect. They were not created like Apple II, Apple III, or whatever, which is perfect in the moment. We are not perfect. We evolve, we learn. Nature makes us what we are, and then we have to learn things to make ourselves better internally, the inner you, and which is what you seek out. That's what makes humans different than animals, is that they don't seek out, they live a life. Not to look down upon them, because lots of animal virtues we seek in human beings. Tell a man that he is like a lion and he is happy for the moment. But at the same time, you tell him you're an animal and he gets angry. So these are the very interesting ways that we humans interpret things. And to learn to become different and to evolve is part of the human learning and the endeavor that makes us what we are, trying to become better. Talking about that, I will move from Banaras to your trip in the United States, your visit to US, where you have addressed many Hindus, particularly, as you said to me, and in temples mostly. Mm-hmm. Share with me and with the audience, how curious were they? They were wanting to know about themselves, or they were also curious, or you see that there is a real awakening happening in them, because Hindus, we have a very interesting process. We are very fast in adjusting and accommodating the other's point of view. That's the reason why India has been home to every person, religion persecuted. They came to India, right? They found home there. The Parsis, the motley number of Parsis exist only in India. You know, the rumors are that the Syrian Christians first arrived in India because they were persecuted in their part of the world. Yes. These are issues that we are very accommodative and adjust, which is what our major strength, the capacity to adjust. However, when your opponent begins to exploit your capacity to adjust, you begin to lose your own identity. So what, if any, your impression is interacting with Hindus in Hindu temple in the US, whether in California, Houston, DC, in New York, all the places that you have been to?
Well, in very many cases, it's exactly the same as with ordinary Hindus in India, namely that they have an attitude of curiosity about other religions. You see, long before they start judging, keeping things at a distance or condemning. You see, first of all, they are very curious. They want to know, and they're very genuinely interested. You see, whereas other people tend to keep a distance, you see, only in very special circumstances will they open up. I'll give a rather unexpected answer. In Banaras, I studied some Sanskrit, and you see, this was very international. Many students from Korea, from Vietnam, and so on were also there. And so I did notice that Hindu students were very interested when texts from the Buddhist Mahayana tradition were translated, whereas the Buddhist students were bored when something from the Mahabharata was translated. Now, you see, that's only a brief impression. I don't want to draw too heavy conclusions from that. But nevertheless, I think it is typical for Hindus that they are genuinely interested in everything in the world. And so that gives them a rather positive attitude towards, for instance, Christianity when it came to India as refugees. Later, of course, you know, it came in a not so pleasant capacity. So that is there. And so when the Moplas settled in Kerala, or the Syrian Christians, or later the Parsi refugees came, Hindus allowed them without asking them any questions. I mean, or they could ask questions out of curiosity, but they never said, okay, first you have to convince us that what you believe is okay, and only then will we accept you. You see, there is this openness of spirit that is natural, and that is still very much also there in many of these activist Hindutva people. You see, I know that there is a movement here in New York with the slogan, Hindus against Hindutva. You know, pretending that this Hindu activist movement is basically non-Hindu. Well, I know what they're talking about. You see, the borrowing of the nationalist paradigm, that was very popular in the West around the First World War. And so that's when these nationalist movements in India were started. And so they have retained a bit of that inspiration. Nevertheless, all the people who join it because they want to do something for Hinduism. So this nationalist paradigm, they'll outgrow that, especially when India is no longer under siege by its neighbors, but that Hinduism is there to stay. And so in that respect, you see, the Hindus of these activist organizations and Hindus in general are not very different. All kinds of people join these movements because at some point they feel they want to do something for Dharma.
That's so truly outstanding, that we are curious people, we want to know authentic interpretation of others the way they are. Stay tuned, we'll be back soon after this short break. Welcome back. As we continue the dialogue on our Hindu way of life, the one thing which is very interesting is that while we are curious to know about others, I find we don't know enough about ourselves. So Hinduism, the way it is, I find that a lot of Hindus don't know enough about ourselves. And that's an inquiry which must be made. It's something like a very simple example. It's like, first one of the management lessons I learned flying. You know, we fly all the time. But for me, the management lesson was that when the air hostess announced that if the cabin pressure falls, the oxygen mask will come, first put it on yourself before you help others, including children. That was a very important lesson. If I'm not well equipped myself, I can't do anything for anybody. So the question then arises is, do we Hindus know enough about ourselves, about our inner self, or is our knowledge remarkably peripheral? And that I know because it seeps into our DNA. Because when I go to India and I talk to people about doing things, they say, we know everything, you don't need to tell us. That false sense of mythical impression that I know everything is part of our undoing, which I believe, frankly speaking, is the undoing of Hindus in terms of how the word Hinduism, Hindutva gets confused. And I'm 100% sure that majority of Hindus themselves don't know what Hindutva is all about. That's the tragic part, but the West always attacks us. The so-called liberal leftists will attack us. The communists will attack that Hindutva is an evil agenda, whereas there's nothing evil about Hinduism. Aberrations and imperfections, yes, but nothing evil about it. So share with us that it is very important, because the narrative, if we don't define ourselves, others define you.
Right.
And others define you from the way they want to define you. And then we begin to say, oh, we are not like this.
Right.
And then we have a conflict or disagreement or just surrender and acceptance.
Right. Well, the fact that many Hindus think they know everything is hangover from long ago, when India was indeed the center of the world, or something important at any rate. The time, for example, when Arabians called their girls Hind, which means India, you see, as a place of riches, of treasure. In those days, they looked up to India. India was the center of science, for example, of progress. And so Hindus have retained some of that mentality, even though later that has been covered over with an inferiority complex after so many centuries of foreign rule. Nevertheless, that basic superiority feeling is also still there. And so that's what comes to the surface when you ask them about really any subject. They think they know. They will come and correct you if they hear something they don't agree with. Okay, it's no big deal. However, if you compare with really hard knowledge, you know, take a lesson from the Jesuits and other Christian missionaries. You see, they really built up a database about Hinduism, about every community, what their needs are, how they can be approached, what their special sensitivities are. There is this Protestant Joshua project that have tabulated all kinds of data. They are online. And so many students who want to know about any particular community in India first go to that database, simply because it's good. Not because they have any missionary project in mind, but simply because there the data are. There is absolutely no such thing from the Hindu side about Christianity. And so in terms of knowledge of the enemy, of the adversary, Hindus can learn quite a bit from others. And the missionaries, of course, are not innocent in that respect. They really do this tabulating in order to know the weak points of the enemy better, in order to know better where they can, with most success, start their missionary offensive.
Now that's very powerful, because this is something which I share the same belief that if you don't define yourself, others do.
Right.
And what is also true is that there was a time in history that India had a 29% of the world trade without English. Think about it. The question then is, while the West built institutions, which is what you are talking about, the Jesuits and Protestants building the database, we did nothing. We failed in creating institutions to confront or address. Now that is what is important for Hindus to do now. That we are now today, we have fortunate. 100 years ago may not have been possible. But in today's world, with the advancement of science and technology and tools that are available to us, we can build our own institutional framework. We can create our own narrative, because right now, there is so much trash written about Hinduism that when you read that, you feel, what the hell is this all about? So how would you relate, and what would your take be, since you are since you are doing what you are doing, an outstanding work to facilitate Hindu religion and faith and principles? What must individual and Hindus must do, and collectively they do? Yeah. Well, what effort needs to be? Do we need a government help? Or in Hindu, the Shankaracharyas should create, ought to create, not should, ought to create an institutional framework that addresses the question. And that brings me to the politics of it. And that is something which I strongly believe in, is the fact that when one Nathuram Godse became an assassin to kill Mahatma Gandhi. Everybody deplores that.
Yes.
I don't think anybody applauds that,
Right.
regardless of the political implications and justifications of
Yes.
that. But RSS is still bearing the cross, if I may say
Right.
so,
Yeah.
as if we Hindus were responsible for killing Gandhi.
Right.
Whereas thousands of Muslims kill thousands of people around the world, but it is still a religion of peace.
Yeah.
Tell us something about it. How does that happen?
Well, Hindus have been very weak in defending their own case, not even trying in most circumstances. And so taking it lying down, looking up to the dominant ideology of secularism, trying to live up to the demands of that ideology, not of Hinduism. And so that has, the last 50, 60 years, that has been predominant. Now, and for example, you have, criticism of Islam or diagnosis of the strategic situation of Hinduism has been done by individuals like Sitaram Goel, a historian. And on the government side, there was nothing of the sort. Even among organized Hinduism, there was very little. And so there you could say, individuals can make the effort, only very few did so. Now, I'd like to add that perhaps we have recently seen a big moment where a shift took place, where the mentality is being changed so thoroughly that now all kinds of things become possible that for 50 years or so had been waiting, or that we had been waiting for in vain. The election victory of Narendra Modi, who is not a militant Hindu at all, but nevertheless is perceived as a militant Hindu, his victory in turn is also perceived as a victory of Hinduism. And so I don't think he made that much difference in that respect. Nevertheless, he is perceived as such. You see, the secularists, the international media have been making this propaganda, the terrible Hindu coming to power, then nothing happened. Now these elections, they have been saying exactly the same thing. You see, 5 years ago they predicted, and now all the Muslims are going to be thrown in the Indian Ocean. And this time they're predicting the same thing, more or less. But you see, these things don't happen. And the first time you could still blame, but that's because of propaganda that he came to power. He misled the people. Now this time they have experienced Modi, and they have only confirmed their mandate for him. So now this second time around, this is giving Hindus a boost of self-confidence. Therefore, I expect the power equation in the ideological field to change. Many secularists now are thinking twice. Their Communist Party has been wiped out. The Aam Aadmi Party has lost big. The Gandhi family has lost. And so they feel like their political patronage is slipping. The really hard ideologues are not going to be influenced, but very many people who were in the secularist camp out of conformism are now slowly going to cross the floor and more or less distancing themselves from the secularist camp. So I think the whole ideological atmosphere is changing, and now you're going to see far more outspoken statements of dharmic commitment.
That's brilliant, and I hope it is. One of the important points is that secularism, the word was added in the Indian Constitution, socialist and secular, during emergency when Mrs. Gandhi had declared emergency. The question to me always comes up that you are a Catholic, you are studying Hinduism, but nobody asked you to convert yourself to Hinduism. You adopted, you liked something. In your path of seeking the truth, you experienced that this is the one which helps me get there. For me, the point is very simple. Is secularism a realistic dish to be had? Or is it what I call imaginary or utopian relish? It is it is ideal something that people
Yeah.
go beyond their religious mandates and
Yeah.
accept all humans as humans. You are white, I'm naturally tanned, as the color I use it.
Right.
So you are white, I'm naturally tanned. Somebody is black, somebody is Japanese, Chinese,
Right.
whatever nationality. But in the creation process or evolutionary process, our nose performs identical function.
Yeah.
Genetically, it is proven now that we are all the same. So if we are able to transcend that path,
Yeah.
the truth, if the world religions begin to accept that truth, not tolerance, but
Right.
acceptance
Yeah,
and
yeah.
respect for whatever one is. So tell us about the impression of secularism as a European, because now Europe is changing. The
Right.
demography of Europe
Yes.
is changing, and that is happening because of immigration.
Right.
The question that bothers me is that why is Europe bending backwards to accommodate
Right.
the Islamic point of view? I'm not talking about
Right.
don't provide a home and support to the poor
Yeah.
who go to Europe for better life.
Right.
Likewise, whoever comes to America, because immigration is all about seeking better economic life or running away from oppression. So when
Yeah.
you are seeking a better life, that's good.
Yeah.
But why is European judiciary? I'm totally aghast
Yes.
that even a European judicial system are looking at the culture. That
Yeah.
culturally they are like that, so we must give them concessions. And there are horror stories, but the media doesn't cover.
Right.
So I'm now trying to bring you into a different kind of a
Right.
conversation as on today,
Right.
as it is, because we are in 21st century. We can't escape that.
Right.
And tomorrow will be all one day older. So the question is that we have to come to the reality of it. Your thoughts?
Secularism started in Europe, and it meant a strict separation of religion and state, the equal treatment of all citizens regardless of their religion. Now, in India, they started talking about this. They never practiced it. According to the constitution, there are a number of discriminations per religion, like the separate family law systems. So India is not a secular state at all. The word secularism, of course, was imported from Europe, along with the word socialism. In that, of course, Nehru is a little bit to blame, but Europe is harder to blame because he got all his ideas from Cambridge that really devastated India for decades. But nevertheless, they're recovering now, fortunately. But so, you see, that secularism came from Europe. In Europe, it was taken quite seriously. But now, indeed, under pressure from a growing Islam, it is giving way. And so the laws haven't changed yet. But for instance, the fact that judges are giving a lenient sentence to Islamic rapists, for example, citing all, the cultural differences, that is worrying. That is not a good development.
We will be back right after this short break. Welcome back. Professor Elst made a mention, which I found was pretty sensational, when he said that India is hardly a secular country from the European point of view because we have different laws for different sects and different practices. But if we know this part of the thing is true, that we have been a Sanatan Dharma practitioners. Hinduism was a name given to us, but in essence, we have been Sanatan Dharmis. For Sanatan Dharmi, it is always the natural laws of nature that operated. So there is no sanction, there is no mandate. We all accepted anybody, whoever they are, in the form of namaste. That said, I have a disagreement on that when you say it is not a secular country. But do you mean secular from the European point of view or the Indian point of view? That is important, because I think as a Hindu, I have been secular all along. For me, I have had Christian friends, Muslim friends, dined with them, whatever else, made no discrimination. Unless and until they began to say, in my Islam, this is not what is happening.
Right, yeah.
We are accepting. So why do you say we are not secular? Is it a Western perspective, or is it your own seeking the truth?
Well, you see, Hindus are secular enough in the meaning of the term that has become common in India. Namely, they're religiously pluralistic, more than tolerant even. So in that sense, you could call them secular. Certainly, more than any other group on earth. However, the word secularism was introduced in India in imitation of a very specific political European term, which meant the separation of state and religion, and so the equality of all citizens regardless of religion before the law. That concept in itself, there's nothing wrong with it, but that was soon distorted by Nehru and especially by his daughter Indira. About 1970 you get a strong turn where the word secular effectively comes to mean anti-Hindu. Like for instance in India you have the strange situation that mullahs and muftis and bishops and so on call themselves secular, whereas their Arab colleagues would abhor this term, are dead against secularism, say that secularism is hubris of human beings who think they can make the laws when in fact the laws made by God should be obeyed. And so in India secularism has acquired a different meaning, namely anti-Hindu. And so in that sense Hindus are not secular, right? Then the distorted meaning, of course, explains a few phenomena, developments in constitutional law. For instance, and most importantly, Article 30 of the Constitution gives minorities, it says explicitly minorities, the right to manage, to found educational institutions, to recruit the teachers they want, the students they want, to have the curriculum they want. And it does not give that right to Hindus. Now that, since about 1970, is definitely interpreted as a discrimination against Hindus. In fact, I've even heard secularist lawyers defend this discrimination. Now, to make a comparison that Americans will certainly understand, in America you have this idea of affirmative action, of giving certain privileges to blacks in compensation for the injustice their ancestors suffered. Now, whether that is the correct policy, okay, I will not meddle, you can debate that, but what you cannot debate is the historical basis for that. The injustice against blacks is simply a fact of history. You can't deny it. Now, what is the corresponding fact in Indian history? Why should the Hindus give privileges to the minorities? Is it because Hindus in the past have committed injustice against the minorities? Well, it's just the opposite. You see, there has been a time when Muslims greatly benefited from being Muslims. Muslims were always advantaged. Many Hindus converted because they had a trial running against their neighbor, and as Muslims they would be greatly in a position of advantage in their trial. To get jobs in court and so on, people converted. Why? Because Islam meant privilege. Because Hindu meant being oppressed. The same thing during the British or the Portuguese rule in India, when it was advantageous to be a Christian. So there is no period in Indian history when the minorities were oppressed by the Hindus. So Hindus have no reason at all to compensate them by giving them privileges. And I'm not saying that the others should compensate the Hindus by returning the privileges. I'm all for a secular state. Everybody equal before the law, regardless of religion.
And what do you think is happening in India when the Muslims have been accepting the criminal law of India? They want to be adjudicated under the criminal law, but they do not want a civil code, common civil code. Now, do you think it is a way to infiltrate and maintain their own identity, never be part of India? Is that so? Will that accusation stand firm, or is it a weak argument?
Well, there is something to it at any rate. They prefer to have their own Islamic law as against the democratic laws voted by Parliament. So that certainly is a measure of taking a distance from India, not necessarily in the form of political separatism like in 1947, but it's maintaining a certain social separateness, undoubtedly.
I have one other thought in my mind which I wanted to talk to you about is the concept of freedom of religion. There are three recognized religions in the world,
Yes.
Christianity, Islam and Judaism. Hinduism comes in as a way of
Yes.
life. Even our Indian Supreme Court says that it's a way of
Right.
life. So is the concept of freedom of religion an unnecessary concept? Because we are born in a particular way, we are part of a particular society and family, and we are where we are. So what was
Yes.
the necessity to have the concept of freedom of religion? Is it the Western narrative of conversion that Christianity, wherever they went and conquered, established their faith, and they
Right.
said, there is a freedom of religion, you are mine, you become mine. So is it a militaristic kind of a stuff made into a great institution, freedom of religion? Or it is something
Right.
that needs to be done away with? Because people are people.
Right. Well, freedom of religion is the natural state of things.
Yeah.
You see, the cavemen did not have religious doctrines that they persecuted others with. So that came about with mainly the monotheistic religions, and the idea of not having religious freedom, of enforcing a religion. And so then you got a reaction of people who wanted to go back to freedom of religion. And so then freedom of religion became an issue. Normally it should not have been mentioned in the Indian Constitution, simply because it's so obvious. When it was mentioned, it was not entirely innocent. You see, I said that there are non-secular elements in the Indian Constitution. Now, this is a subtle element of non-secular article in the Constitution. Namely, freedom of religion is defined as the right to profess a religion, but also to propagate a religion. Now, in that sense, the concept is unknown to Hindus and Parsis. Parsis are even more adamant than Hindus that they don't want conversions. And whereas for Christianity it's essential. And Jesus himself has given the task to all Christians to go and teach all mankind, meaning to make them Christians. And so it is the missionaries especially who have lobbied, who have made sure that freedom of religion was defined in this way. And so though Hindus in principle would have nothing against the right to propagate, in the specific case of India, it is not so innocent as it seems. And so when Hindus protest against the fact of conversion, Christians then like to slap them with this constitutional article, but not highlighting the fact that they themselves have lobbied very hard to get that in. And so that is absolutely a Christian conception of religion, even regardless of the question of whether this propagation and so on is correct. The fact that religion is understood this way as a particular conviction that you have or don't have, that is a typical Christian influence. That's not there in Hinduism.
That's truly brilliant. Thank you very much for elaborating on that. The other part which I personally deal with that, and I want to talk about it with you, is that does the world, I often find very severe attack by journalists on Hinduism. As you said earlier, that if you talk about your faith, you are already branded as a Hindutva extremist. You are not a secular if you talk about your own faith the way it is. So the question then arises, is that Sanatan practice is universal practice. You know that. I don't need to tell you that. You are a student and a scholar of Hinduism. So Sanatan practice is all about natural laws. With the advancement in science and technology, this instrument in the hands of anybody, this has no religion.
Right.
Just as diseases have no religion, right? Occupation has no religion. People do whatever they do. Do you think that with the advancement of science and technology, there is a rise of atheism in the West? People are abandoning what the hell, right? So, people are asking questions. If God was so kind, why does he kill people in natural disasters?
Right.
So these are the kind of things which have begun to happen. Do you think the Sanatan Dharma will get accepted with yoga and meditation the way it has become the way of life? Do you feel that the organized religion, as I call
Right.
it,
Yeah.
they fear or they're concerned, the intrusion
Yeah.
or the headway, I wouldn't use the word intrusion, but the headway our way of life is doing? Because my friend has a Indic chair in LMU, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and UCLA. And there they are teaching Hindu philosophy, yoga and everything else. And people from Saudi Arabia, women from Saudi Arabia and other countries are accepting the fact that God is so smart that he makes you bow to him and all of us go down on our knees. Whether you do Purna Shashtang or Ardha Shashtang,
All right.
whether you go to church or mosque, you go down on your knees. So that practice makes people realize that, hey, we are all the same. Do you think that the West organized religion is taking preemptive steps to ensure that this way of life doesn't become part of life?
Well, there are Christian strategists, like in the 1960s when many youngsters were enamored of Oriental stuff, not only religion, also like music by Ravi Shankar and so on. But so when there was this craze for things Indian, they saw a certain danger to Christianity, and they thought about what to do. And so one element, for instance, that you can see and experience is the very negative image created for Hinduism that wasn't there 50 years ago. That partly due to this mobilization. But you see, most Christians just go along. I mean, there is more and more Hindu presence here, not just people coming from India, but simply ideas coming from India. And that is influencing them. And so the idea that if you don't believe in Jesus, you will go to hell, rather few Christians still believe that, at least in the West. So there is a movement out of Christianity that in many people, especially in America, takes the form of taking Christianity a bit more lightly, which in Europe mostly takes the form of leaving Christianity altogether. But in fact, they are the same movement motivated by the same evolution, which is the democratization of the scientific worldview. And so religiosity can still have a place, but these specific doctrines of someone getting resurrected or a virgin giving birth or so, that can no longer be sustained.
That's so brilliant. And this has been a great conversation, but it will not be complete if I do not ask you one particular question. Is that I did not do an opposition research on you, but whatever I read about you, you have been branded in the Western media as an extreme right-wing Hindutva guy.
Yeah.
Now, is it part of the same conspiracy? Because, hey, I remember, I give you a reference to that. When Julia Roberts made the movie Eat, Pray, Love, and she lived in India for 4, 5, 6 months. And when she came back, she made a statement. She's my favorite actress. She made a statement that, I'm adopting the Hindu way of life. And the Catholic Church went against that part of it. How can you abandon Catholicism? She said, I'm not leaving my religion. I'm adopting their way of life. So how did you get branded as an extreme Hindutva guy?
Well, two things. To some extent, this is a European phenomenon, namely the fact that I criticized Islam. You see, when I started doing that, this was in the time of the Rushdie affair, the Satanic Verses, 1989. A large section of the left was still pro-secular and therefore critical of Islam. Like my first article about that was in a communist weekly. And then you see in the 90s when right-wing parties started to grab the anti-Islamic agenda, then suddenly the whole left became pro-Islamic, and then people like me, of course, became outcasts. So that in itself has nothing to do with India. But then specifically for India, I would say there has been a negative influence from some Indological academics in the West, but the the main drive to keep me out, to boycott me, comes from Indians.
Is it so?
Very definitely.
And why would that be? If you can tell me in 30 seconds now. We are out of time.
Well, because there is a strong anti-Hindu movement in India. And so they see that I can be useful to that movement, so therefore I have to be shunned or blackened or somehow rendered ineffective.
Dr. Elst, it has been a pleasure to have you in the studio. Thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation. I have enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Have a great weekend. See you next week again.